Fellow minders, welcome back to the Mind of Watercolor. Well, today we're talking about a color, or a non-color, depending on your viewpoint, white. Yeah, it's the bane of the watercolor traditionalist's existence. Or the magical friend of the mixed media artist and the watercolorist who just doesn't give a flying flip about tradition. Well, today I'm comparing 5 watercolor whites. Something I'm actually doing for myself. I've had these sitting around and kind of wondering what the real differences are. Are there any differences? And what would I prefer? Should be interesting. Bone is not white. It's kind of an off-white. Besides, dude, I've told you, you are plastic. And a sickly yellow plastic, to be precise. Well, just keeping it real. Anyway, let's go test some white. What I wanted to do is look at 5 different whites, watercolor whites to be exact. These are all water soluble, re-wettable. So I'm zeroing in on a category. Now I have another video that I'll link to, and you can watch, where I compare all the different white categories that you might possibly use in watercolor when you need an opaque white. And that will include other things like gel pens and acrylic. And that one is really just a categorical breakdown. It doesn't get into a lot of product comparison. But I wanted to zero in probably the most used popular category, and that is actual water-soluble watercolor white. Okay, so what I have here is the ever popular and ubiquitous Dr. Martin's bleed-proof white, Kirotaki Zig Whiting 30, Copic, or Copic, sorry, opaque white. Another Dr. Martin's product we'll take a look at, and that is the Dr. Martin's pen white. What is this? Why is it different? Or how is it different from this? And last but not least, probably the most common white for watercolor is gouache. And I chose Winsor Newton gouache to represent that category. It's again, probably the most popular. So let's take a look at these, and I will be demonstrating them on black watercolor paper. I did very quickly touch on this in another video. I didn't really do a lot of painting. But Stonehenge Aqua has a black 100% cotton watercolor paper. Amazing. Someday I'm going to think of something that I can paint, but we'll do our testing on this. All right, we're going to start with the most well-known probably, and that's Dr. Martin's bleed-proof white. This right here is one that I used years and years ago, and it's fine. I mean, it's probably one of the most highly recommended watercolor whites out there, highly opaque. You're usually able to find this just about anywhere that sells art supplies. So it's got a lot of things going for it. I actually abandoned this some years ago because when the jar dries out, and they will eventually dry out, it would turn into little bitty fine granules. I don't know if it still does that or not. I have had that happen on a palette even recently, and even with other types of things like gouache. So I don't know the cause of that. I'm sure it's some sort of crackling and shrinkage that happens with water. But basically, it's reconstitutable even when you have those little granules. But it was a lot of hassle to reconstitute. And inevitably, I didn't get all of them. And then when I went to apply the white, I'd end up with those little granules on the surface. Now, a new bottle, or a bottle that's not years and years old, I probably had the bottle I'm talking about for a bunch of years, is fine. It's the consistency usually of pudding. If you see it starting to get firm, you can add a little bit of water. I will usually go in and stir it up, either with a small palette knife or a stick. You can also buy these little, I think these are little scientific spatulas for like measuring powder and stuff. But as I go into this, it's about the consistency of pretty firm pudding. And this is a brand new bottle. I just bought this for the purposes of this review. And it will soften it up. So as I start to stir this and churn it a little bit, it gets a little more malleable. This is pretty much true of all of them. Now I have my palette here. I'm going to use this gray palette. This is a New Wave palette from Hobby Lobby. I'll try to put a link to something similar on Amazon if I can find one. I like gray palettes for opaque paint because you can see what you have in terms of translucency, opacity, and consistency really, really well. So I don't necessarily use white this way unless I'm going to be using a lot of it. Most of the time, if you're just highlighting or using it in spots, you can just go right out of the jar. As a matter of fact, one tip I can leave you is that the lid, if you're just spotting or highlighting, the lid makes a really excellent place just to bring a little bit with your brush here, add a little water if you need to, and thin it out. I put a nice consistency of it out here just as it came out of the jar. And what I like to do is take some water in my brush, bring out a thinned tail of it. I'll get a little more water. I'll continue to thin it out and pull it out until I end up with something very translucent out here. It gets more opaque as you go back. Get some of this thinned down, and I make some swatches. This is glass, so it's beating up quite a bit. For the next, and I just make a little kind of white scale, gray scale in reverse. So I come back in here with a little more paint and a little less water, and I check the consistency yet again. Then I come up here, and we're still very fluid and watered down, but there's a lot more paint now. What this does is it not only tests the white for you, but it gives you an idea of what consistency you need to achieve a certain effect. So it's a great little kind of art lab experiment. And last but not least, I come right into the puddle. I might bring in just a little bit of the water that's actually on my palette if it feels too stiff. We have our fourth swatch, which by now, it's a decent white. It should be almost completely opaque. This is not going to be scientific. We may arrive at no conclusions today about a best or this, that, the other. Mainly, I just want you to see what's available. I want you to hear my thoughts on each brand. And one may be available to you and not another. Or maybe you've tried one and you want to try a different one. So all of these, I will say, are useful. I did not find any throwaways in this group. Most of these are considered correction or highlighting mediums, and they're not intended to mix with color. As a matter of fact, Dr. Martin's Bleed Proof White will even tell you it's not intended for mixing. Now, what it's intended to do and what it will do sometimes are different things. So we're going to discover that you actually can color them a little, but it's not the purpose. But you may want to tint the white. You know, sometimes you just want a very blue white, or sometimes you want a very warm or yellowish or orangish white. Still white, but just warmed like an eggshell. And that's possible. That's actually possible with all of these, I believe. This is going to kind of be my control of sorts. I'm going to probably compare all of them to this. If you go online and do a search, you'll find blog after blog, calligraphers, pen and ink artists, time and again recommending this. So despite my little granular issues that I've had with it, it's fine. It's going to do you okay. Now, the other two tests I want to do, we're going to test viscosity and flow. In other words, how thick, if we get to an opaque state, how thick do you have to get it to get there? Pretty much any of these will be completely opaque, but some will do it to a thinner consistency than others. The other is, what kind of flow do you get? In other words, how much do you need to thin it to flow nicely off a thin brush like a rigger, or to flow out of a pinpoint like this? I'm going to start with the thickest paint, and I'm going to just come back into the water, and you may have to replenish your water if you're doing this test yourself. Just enough until I feel like it's flowing. So I'm nearly opaque here, coming back just a little bit. And what kind of a flow off the tip do I get? Really nice. Flows evenly, effortlessly, without making a dry brushy streak. And I can go almost to the bottle consistency. Again, this is not going to be scientific because depending on how long you've had these on your shelf, how long it's been on an art supplier's shelf. The consistency in the bottle, even brand new, is going to differ a little, but it should be pretty pudding-like. That's normally what you see. And this is flowing off the brush, even almost bottle consistency, pretty well. I'm starting to get a little dry brushy here. All right, I'm going to test this on a dip pen, which I needed to clean off here. All right, got my Takakawa holder and a Zebra G nib. This is the way I load a nib with a brush. Try to paint over those little holes there. I've seen calligrapher after calligrapher recommend this as their favorite. Nice. Do some quick strokes, which usually test how well it's flowing. Beautiful. Just perfect flow, really. Very satisfying. You can see with this nib, I can get just wispy hairlines. I'm going to deal with color as a final footnote. My belief is they will all do the same thing, but we'll demonstrate that in the end. By the way, I apologize for my fingernails if that grosses you out. I don't know why it would, but I guess some people, I try to keep my fingernails nicely groomed, but I play a little bit of guitar and it requires these four have a little bit of a fingernail since I do a classical finger style. That's all I'm going to say about that. I got a really ugly comment the other day. That's the reason they're there. Sorry if it offends you, but I'm afraid they're staying. All right, the next one we're going to look at is the Kirotaki Zig Whiting 30. Now, I really like this. I bought this several years ago, and it's been sort of my go-to white for a while. It's never even come close to drying out. It has about the same off-the-shelf consistency that a brand new bottle of Martin's Bleed-Proof White has. Pudding-like. I'm going to use a stick this time. Almost identical. But I'll tell you, I've had this for at least 7 years. And it's still this consistency. And there's only like a half a bottle left. Now, Kirotaki is a Japanese product. And with inkers, it's used as a correction fluid mostly. Or a highlighter. Well, I guess that's basically what we're talking about for everybody. Now, the consistency here I can already see is different. For one thing, it's not beating up like this did. Now, there is a difference in consistency, which probably means there's some kind of difference in the binder. Anyway, I'm going to try to get a nice gradient of opacity here. Once again, not very scientific. There's going to be human error in how much water I have compared to the previous sample. But really all this is supposed to serve to do is tell me the opacity and flow at each stage of water added. Nearly to the jar consistency. Getting a lot more opaque. Okay, and then almost as completely jar consistency as possible with almost no thinning whatsoever. Highly, highly opaque, just like Dr. Martin's. I'm going to try to get a little more. This is still real watery, so just to make my scale turn out right. So I'm getting a comparison, opacity comparison, almost identical, accounting for human differences in how much water I have here. What the biggest difference I am noticing is thinned out, how much more of a smooth flow I'm getting here versus that. That was kind of dramatic to me. Let's test the rigor, and I'm way up here, just as I was with Dr. Martin's. I'm way up here next to jar consistency, just a little water. Feel like I'm getting a little more ink at that consistency, a little more flow, which is easily adjusted with either one. So it's just at this consistency, I'm getting a little more coming off the brush, it feels like. Super smooth, effortless flow with a lot of white. We're also going to come back at the end and do a water re-wetting test. See if one does better than another. I also have, you can't see it off camera, but up there I've got my 2 water bowls. One that I'm cleaning out the brush in and one that I'm adding clean water with so as not to cross-contaminate from types. Very smooth flow. Very. just like with the rigger, in the very, very thinnest, finest lines, I do seem to be getting a little bit more white or opacity. All right, on to Copic white. Copic opaque white. Once again, we have the same consistency. This is a newer jar than this White Ink 30. Not as new as this bleed proof white, but consistency is almost identical. That, I'm assuming, is what the manufacturers are after, is that slightly runny pudding consistency. Very similar to the Kirotaki. Very similar flow. All right, here's our translucent one. This, by the way, I didn't mention price. They're all similar in price. This one I found was the most expensive, the Copic, at least on Amazon. Now let's get up here close to bottle consistency. Really like the flow of this one too. I mean, it just glides on. All right, now we're gonna dip into bottle consistency. Once again, just slides off the brush. Very little discernible difference in opacity versus viscosity and consistency. I would say out of the bottle and in applying it so far, Dr. Martin seems to be the most viscous, if you will, in that it flows a little differently than these two. Not necessarily badly, it just different. Really feels, in this regard, feels a little more like the Dr. Martens. Again, it could be the loading, just human difference in the way I loaded the brush. Totally satisfactory, though. Nice flow at almost full bottle consistency. And so far, all three of these bottle consistencies have been pretty much identical. If you have a bottle that ends up drying out and needs to be reconstituted, that's probably a good benchmark. It's just, first, if there's any fluidity to it at all, stir it thoroughly. If it's too hard to do that, then, you know, add a little bit of water at a time and stir it until you get that consistency. If I had to say so far, there might be just a smidge more opacity to the Dr. Martens. That could be owing to the slightly higher feeling of the viscosity. I just like the way both of these, the White Ink 30 and the Copic, I just like the way they thin out into a more ink-like substance that has a smoother flow. I mean, you can just tell. Don't know that that really matters on watercolor, but the difference is there. It's discernible. All right, moving on. This is Dr. Martin's Pen White. Now, this is also a highlighting and correctional white. This is specifically designed for technical pens and airbrush, neither of which I really use anymore. So the most equatable thing I can think of would be the rigger and the dip pen. But there's no reason it can't be brushed on too. This is different. This comes in a bottle with an eyedropper. So right away I thought, oh, this is going to be liquid. And sure enough, I am never very satisfied or happy with these paint eyedroppers. They always seem to get really clogged, and this one was no exception. I haven't had this one long. I can't remember why I bought it. I think I was curious. I'm going to set the eyedropper aside. I rarely use those except in like India ink bottles. Get my little spatula, and yeah, we're at a much more fluid capacity here, or excuse me, consistency. It's thinner and more fluid than pudding, even runny pudding. It's there, you can see it's like heavy cream. So right out of the bottle, that's going to have a more fluid consistency. Now that may be kind of cool actually if you're looking for flow from a pen or a brush like a rigger and minimal thinning. As a matter of fact, I'm going to put some here at bottle consistency, and again, it's about the consistency out of the bottle as this was down here with a little water added. I am going to put another because I don't want the water to totally dilute it all. I'm going to put another bit here for thinning. So that's interesting. I guess probably something very similar to their bleed proof white made thinner, and I'm hoping more opaque at that thinner consistency. All right, let's see what we got here. So I'm going to take this second puddle here and I'm going to thin it out. Nice flow. Again, it does tend to bead and shrink back like its big brother up here, the bleed proof white. So we probably have some similarities in flow additives and binder, of which I have no idea what they are. I do want to get a thin mixture down here though, a little more effortless to thin. And so this translucent mixture down here is very watery, very watery. I can attest to the fact that being an airbrush artist once upon a time, that would be a big advantage. I don't know that I ever saw this when I was doing my airbrush work. Opaque whites were always something that airbrush artists were searching for. My favorite was Badger, which seemed to be the most opaque, and I would usually take that and even use it on a brush for corrections. A lot of artists did that. A lot of illustrators did that trick. Badger was probably the most opaque white airbrush paint. The FW inks were pretty opaque. Just reminiscing on my airbrush days. Those were the days. I don't really miss them. A lot of fumes and paint particles in the air. You had to wear a mask and it gets all over everything. Don't miss it. Don't miss it at all. All right, I'm up here near the first thin consistency. So, wow, just, you thought these two flowed effortlessly? This one is like silk in comparison. That's interesting. Definitely made that to flow. Look at the opacity. I'm trying to get the same kind of scale, but at a more fluid level. If fluidity and watery consistency is important to you while maintaining opacity, this may be a great choice. All right, we're going to go right into the bottle consistency now, which is still almost like ink. How opaque is that going to be? Really opaque. I can't remember the last time I tested this pen white. I certainly never did these comparisons, so that's really of interest to me. And I can only assume that because it's made for pens, it's going to flow really well off a brush. Yeah, super nice. Can't say it's really any better than the Copic or the White Ink 30. It's certainly a match. Makes me wonder, all those calligraphers out there, pointed pen calligraphers especially, they recommend this and there's a ton of them. Makes me wonder how many of them ever actually tried this. Yeah, look at that. You pointed pen calligraphers out there. There's your white right there. Yeah, baby. That's good. And this is, it's not dry yet, so it's a little hard to tell, but so far that's the most opaque patch yet. Swatch, I mean. Dr. Martin's pen white is still a current product, widely available. It was on Amazon. It was on Jet Pens, John Neal Books, and Paper and Ink Arts, which are both calligraphy sites. It was on all of those. I imagine if I went to Blick or Jerry's Autorama or places like that, I would find it too. I'll just make a quick observation. Unless you're mostly going to do pen work and you need it to flow very opaquely off of a thin point, you might want to go for one of the more viscous options, because you still have the option of thinning it down, and there's still plenty opaque. But if you're going to do a lot of white pen writing or fine hatching work with white, man, this is hard to beat. And if that's mainly all you're going to do, it's a good option. All right, on to last but not least. And this was the first white for watercolor I ever knew about. Big advantage here is that you can mix colors with this. And I'm talking about full mixing of all different colors and hues. That's not recommended for any of these other corrections, although I'm going to show you in a bit that you can tint the whites if you need a white tinted, and most times we do. Yeah, so what I recommend here is those other bottle products are a good example of what consistency to mix this to until you have a pudding-like consistency, which is the way at least these three up here came out of the bottle. Nice smooth gradient I'm getting out here. If you already have white gouache, it's probably all you need. So here's about where I ended up on those others. Unlike the others, it comes out of the tube the way paint comes out of a tube, like a paste. So it's all about the consistency you mix to. All right, let's go up here where it's fairly thick. Nothing wrong with those swatches, let me tell you. You know, and like I said at the beginning, we may not arrive at any conclusions like, oh, you better buy this, or this is the best. This is just maybe to satisfy your curiosity. I'm always just as happy to show somebody why they shouldn't buy something as why they should. As I've seen other YouTubers say, I'd buy it so you don't have to. Okay, well, I can see I've got a lot of water in that because it's graying down a lot. So I'm getting a more opaque flow now, but I've also got an awful lot of paint in there. But I'm satisfied that you could come close to a consistency with gouache that works just fine, especially this gouache. Also, that is graying out considerably. So the wonderful opacity I had is not showing as much now as it soaks up the water. Not a problem. You can just add a little more consistency, or pigment. Putting gouache in a dip pen is nothing new. Artists have been doing it for generations. But let's just do it to say we did it. If I get it too fluid, it's beating up, which makes me wonder if some of these others are just formulated more to flow like ink. All right, so gouache, actual gouache is, I think, a real option, an alternative. Just fine. If you already have that, that's probably sufficient. You just may need to thin it to a slightly heavier consistency to match the qualities of these others. Let's do a quick re-wetting test. This probably needs to dry a little more. I'm going to take some water and dampen my brush, and I'm going to go on each of the swatches that have the most pigment. In other words, the nearly opaque swatch with just a wet brush, but not dripping wet. You can see over here that how much it's pulling out. About what you would expect. That's Dr. Martin's. And I'm just testing it on my finger. I want to get the same amount of water. Now this is just bringing back a memory all of a sudden. One of the reasons why I chose Zig Whiting 30 is it is actually like an ink. I'm not getting any re-wetting at all on the paper. Interesting. Why did I not know that? Probably because I've never tried to do it. Just use it to correct with. So we're going to call this Zig Whiting 30 an outlier and pretty much permanent. How about that? Let's look at the Copic opaque white. All right, we're getting a more of a bleed-proof white situation here. I actually have more water in my brush. That re-wets like the bleed-proof white and more like a gouache would. Pen white is pretty much dry. Let's check it out. Yeah, same. And I already know gouache does that. In fact, gouache does it the most. And that's another drawback to gouache, is it re-wets quite a lot. That really surprised me. And I guess I didn't know that. I thought that that was re-wettable. And this is the whole reason I wanted to do this, folks, is for me as much as for you. I have these sitting around. I've tried them. I have never sat down and meticulously kind of compared them to each other. All right, let's one last thing, and let's talk about color. There are going to be times, a lot of times actually, at least there is with me, where I want the white to be tinted. Now, we're not talking about mixing up bright, saturated colors. We're talking about white, highlight white, but we're talking about a warm white or a cool white. My suggestion is just to bring in a little bit of watercolor. A little bit. And you might even be able to use some palette dirt. And do bring it from your watercolor over to your white. Don't bring the white into your watercolor palette, okay? You just end up with a mess. But bring just a little bit in. This is the Copic. And you see how I'm getting a very, very pale. But that orange, that yellow-orange is countering the sort of blue-white, bleached white look and warming it up. Second way is you can just do a very light glaze, and you want to make sure that you don't have a lot of moisture in your brush. Just almost dry brush, but I'm putting just ever so slightly. And you can do this even on dot highlights, so you can just dot a little color on top. That's a backing technique. I've talked about that in one of my gouache videos. Again, I just warmed up that white really nicely. Just be careful because I was already starting to loosen up some of that bleed-proof white. So you don't want to have a very wet brush. All right, everyone. I hope that was useful to you. I know it was to me. It's something I've been wanting to do for a while, and I thought maybe you would benefit by me going through it and showing myself as well as you. This was a real revelation. Never realized that was completely or nearly permanent, but I learned a lot about all of these. Ask questions if you have it. This was certainly not exhaustive. I'm sure there's other whites out there. If there are, you can test them in a similar way. And again, I appreciate everybody watching. Thank you so much. 1,000 thanks to my patrons. You are the lifeblood of this channel. I appreciate you so much, and we will see everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.